Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, a special one, a bit of a treat. We have joining us from Columbus, Ohio, Mr. Paul Linden. Paul is a senior Aikido teacher, the founder of Being in Movement, Mind-Body Training, an expert bodyworker, karate black belt, Feldenkrais trained, and a few other things to boot. Also joining us from the United States, all the way from Tucson, Arizona, we have Shinzen Young. So Shinzen Young is one of my favorite meditation teachers, a really broad perspective on meditation from his studies, monastic studies in Asia. He speaks a number of Asian languages, has extremely... Well, let me say what they have in common, these guys. Why have I done a podcast with two people? For the first time, we've done a podcast like this. I thought these guys are both kind of geniuses in their field. They're people who I've selected from many, many potential teachers and traveled to train with because of their rigor, their logic, also their humor and their humanity. And for me, this is a particular combination of the very scientific, the very logical, but combined with still having a sense of humor and with a certain heart, shall we say. So I am extremely happy to bring you both together for this extended episode.
I'm just as happy, and you make me sound so good, I should go to one of my own workshops and see what he's like.
I've always been good at marketing you. Okay, so say briefly what you do. So I've kind of given my version of it. How would your... Imagine you were invited to a party and you weren't off meditating or something like that. How would you describe your work to people? And let's go Paul and Shinzen.
Okay. Basically, what I'm trying to do is give people the awareness of the body and the reflex responses to being challenged, threatened, or hurt, which is all about reducing awareness and becoming smaller in many ways. And what I've done is find simple, difficult ways of becoming open, wide, heartfelt, compassionate, and powerful. And that, I think, is the way of reducing a lot of the problems we face. I have Parkinson's, and it's a marvelous way to practice all of this.
So, Paul, your work is applied everything. This working with the fight-flight response is work applied everywhere from martial arts, trauma recovery, and you practically invented the field of embodied peace building.
Yes.
So, there's broad applications, some of which we can get into. Shinzen.
I wear two hats. I'm professional, full-time, lifelong meditation teacher, or in more modern language, I guess I would say mindfulness teacher. So that's one of the hats. As you mentioned, although I've been trained within the Buddhist tradition, I tend to look at contemplative practice as a unity across time and across cultures. So I teach a broad view on contemplative practice. That's one hat. The other hat is science, specifically neuroscience, more specifically the field of contemplative neuroscience, which is turning the lens of science to contemplative experience. So it's straddling two worlds. One is what you might call a first-person perspective, that is to say, quote, subjective or introspective, meditating decades, here's what I experienced. That's called a first-person approach because in science, you don't like to use words like subjective or introspective because they're pejorative. So you just say, well, that's a first person. And then science is by way of contrast contrast third person. We have equations, we monitor quantified events, look for relationships, rates of change, and so forth. So I like to think of the modern mindfulness movement as contemplative practice and modern science co-evolving. And so my main goal is to further that co-evolution. And there are two sides to it. The first is what science can bring to the table to improve contemplative practice moving forward in this and subsequent centuries. Then there's what contemplative practice can bring to the table to help science achieve its Aristotelian entelechy. It's where it needs to go, because there may be things that contemplative practice brings to the table that will help science in a significant way, once again moving forward in this century and subsequent centuries. So to me, that's one of the most exciting concepts ever in the history of humanity, is that the core of religion and the core of logic and evidence, exemplified by contemplative practice on one hand and science on the other hand, that these should find a natural basis for nurturing each other. If this is true, if this works out, this is one of the most important tipping points in the history of our species. So I have been privileged to be part of what might be the beginning of something big, or maybe not so much. Like the U.S. ball player Yogi Berra said, I love this quote, "I never make predictions, especially about the future." So I'm not going to predict that there will be this love affair between science and contemplative practice that produces wonder children. I don't know that that will happen, but it could happen, and it could be very, very important in sort of helping our species come to some sort of settling point or maturity, because we're pretty freaking immature, aren't we?
Okay, so you are the big picture guy, as you've admitted many times, and Paul is nothing but the detail guy in some ways. So what you do share in common, though, is this love of science, and it's almost a dirty word in some embodiment type circles, or it's kind of tagged on in a kind of artificial after the event way. Paul, why is the scientific method critical to your work?
Yes, as I listened to Shinzen, there is a third cutting edge, if you can say that, of the scientific method. I basically teach people to observe and feel and be aware of their bodies, and then we reframe their body actions as hypotheses about how the world works and how the human works in the world. Once I've done that, I can test those hypotheses by setting up a movement experiment of some kind. And if it doesn't work, then you have to say that hypothesis is disconfirmed. Can we find a better body action that will do the job you want without the costs? One of the things that I always remember, one of the women in your course commented about me. She said, he talks like a scientist, but he's kind. That's a very strange but.
Yes, that was Sonia, my ex-girlfriend and good friend. Yes, she was a physiotherapist, and she'd never met anyone quite like you.
Well, that's not surprising. Neither have I. But I can give you a quick example. If I ask somebody to take a defensive posture, you're feeling defensive, show me what that looks like. They will usually cross their arms, protect their chest, get small, and then I can poke them. When they spread their arms wide, loosen everything, I can't touch them because they will move well to prevent me.
And both of you have come from before we return to kind of science and logic, I think it's worth spending a little time on kind of where you guys come from, in that there are fairly superstitious traditions. We might say pre-modern, we might say fundamentalist, there's different words for it, that you've both kind of emerged more or less painfully out of. So would either of you like to speak to the kind of the superstitions or the orthodoxies that exist in the martial arts and the meditation world?
Paul, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. As far as the orthodoxies that exist in the martial arts world, that's the shadow side of the teacher knows more than I do. The dark part is the teacher often abuses the students, uses the students for one thing or another, and that will destroy the teacher. If the teacher is allowed to take the guru posture of I am good, everything I do is excellent, that will destroy him or her sooner or later.
And there's also this resistance to the kind of investigative method. So I've seen you work with martial artists, and they'll say, look, I think this is the case. And you'll say, well, let's test it. Let's see, let's try. And you'll quite clearly show them it's not the case, or something else is the case. And yet there'll be a resistance to taking on a new view based on very, very clear evidence sometimes.
Well, I just had an instance where a number of people from a peacemaking tradition were working with me. And I asked them to do something that was threatening to them, because once we had the feeling of threat, then we could investigate what they did to stay peaceful under that circumstance. And they all got disturbed and resistant. They wouldn't use any of what I was trying to teach them because they were uncomfortable and didn't want to try something new.
Yes, Shinzen would call that trigger practice, I believe, like working with deliberate kind of threat or challenge and then applying a certain technique. And there's a word I often hear in the United States now, which is that I'm uncomfortable with that, or that felt, and it's become a sort of place you're not allowed to go, which is very difficult if the training itself involves discomfort of one kind or another.
Actually, I think the phrase, how shall I put it? In Japanese, they have an expression, Karoshi monku. It means a phrase that you can't come back from because it's so loaded. I believe the loaded phrase you're referring to is, you make me feel unsafe.
Yes, that's another place in a different way where I use the scientific method, more attached to linguistics. I try to get people to stop using passive language. You stepped on my pet turtle and you made me so mad. That's the structure of our language. And it seems to suggest that what I feel is under your control. I have people instead say, you stepped on my pet turtle and I made myself so mad about it. It's a cumbersome way of speaking, but it focuses the responsibility on your body and your methods of dealing with things.
There's a radical kind of self-responsibility in that's quite at odds with some aspects of modern culture, isn't there?
Yeah. One of the things that I find as a way of communicating this, I will punch somebody in the stomach, not hard, we just pretend it's hard. And I say, why does it hurt? And the usual answer is because you hit me. And I ask them to punch me and I block it. It hurt because you didn't block. That's not blaming the victim. It's just saying the answer, it hurt because you hit me, is the way the world should be. You shouldn't hit me. It hurt because I didn't block is the way the world is. I have to take care of myself. So it's a radically different linguistic turn, and it makes a difference in how people think.
And Shinzen, have you had particular resistances to looking at mindfulness in the sort of logical, secular way? Because I love how you break it down, and it's different from, say, the Zen tradition that you've studied or some of the Vajrayana traditions you've studied. You've broken it down in a very kind of clear and clean way.
Well, I would say, you talked about, quote, painfully extracting yourself from some sort of matrix. I would have to say that in my case, the process has not really been painful. It was pretty natural and effortless. And there's a reason for that. there is a collection of reasons, not just one, but a whole bunch of reasons why Buddhist practice is sort of at the center of contemplative neuroscience. I won't go into all the reasons right now, it's interesting, but I will go into one reason why it sort of seems like the Buddhist type stuff is very prominent in contemplative neuroscience studies. You don't see as much reference to Christian traditions or Jewish, or even for that matter, Hindu, although there's some of that. So I'm just going to delve into one of the many reasons why Buddhism currently sort of dominates the landscape of this science contemplative interaction. And the reason is because although, as you mentioned, each of the currently existing major Buddhist training traditions, which are Hinayana, the small vehicle, Mahayana, the great vehicle, and Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, those three vehicles are exemplified by Southeast Asian practice, East Asian practice, and Trans-Himalayan practice geographically currently. So if you look at those traditions, there is a lot that you could say is at odds with logic and evidence. Or if you wanted to go pejorative, you could say it's superstition. There's a lot there in those traditions. That is true. But the practitioners of those traditions also know, because they've studied modern history, they know that those traditions are later developments. And our best picture of what the Buddha himself taught was is in the Pali literature. And the impression that we get from the historical Buddha himself is he was less of a religious figure and more of a proto-scientist of what we might call the science of human happiness, understood in the broadest and deepest sense. So qualities that we would associate with a scientist are there in early Buddhism. Now, even in early Buddhism, it's still mixed with things that modern people would not accept. But hey, we're talking about someone that lived 2,500 years ago. So that's a very long time ago, a very different world. But we can point to a lot of things about the historical Buddha himself that, as I say, make him look more like a proto-scientist and less like a religious figure. And whatever Buddhist tradition you might be in, if you have a modern education, you actually know that. And so when someone like me or the Dalai Lama comes along and says, if there are things in Buddhism that don't agree with science, we're going to have to chuck that. You don't get, you may get pushback, but you get less pushback than you might think. I mean, it's a little hard to imagine the Pope saying, well, in the future, if there are doctrines of the church that get disconfirmed by science, well, we're going to just chuck those, because in the end, science is a better barometer. It's a little hard to imagine a Pope doing that. And yet the Dalai Lama did that for Buddhism. How can he do that? Well, it's because at the beginning, it doesn't look as much like a religion as it does now.
Yeah, and there's, if I may pull this, the religions aren't all equal in this regard. I mean, if Buddhism may have this proto sort of scientific approach, Judaism has a long tradition of kind of upgrading. Christianity has sort of occasional and very painful upgrades. And in Islam, it's absolutely not allowed. This is the Quran is the final and perfect revelation, according to Islam. So just that, there's a postmodern idea that all religions of the world are kind of equal in regard to things like this. And that simply is not the case.
I think one of the benefits of the martial arts, if you do a move and it doesn't work, you can't say, see, I know how to do it, so it doesn't work. That's what I meant to do. You have to say, I blew it. Let me try again, see if I can improve my movement. So there's always an ongoing evolutionary pressure on your movement. And it's very clear, if you stop to ponder it at all, that it's not just physical techniques. It's an attitude of presence and awareness and willingness to engage kindly with an opponent that allows you to develop the freedom of movement and the freedom of perception to see where he wants to go and help him go there. But it's within the testing of, did it work? If he punched you, didn't work.
I'm curious, who was your main Aikido teacher, and perhaps who was that person's teacher?
Well, I started off with two people, Bill Witt and Robert Nadeau. And Robert Nadeau studied in Japan when the founder was still alive. He's difficult, so I don't have much contact with him anymore. Bill Witt was Saito style, which is very cut and dried, very engineering. And I couldn't learn in either of those styles. Nadeau is a California mystic, and so I set about developing exercises for myself to bring my body online. Then I could start to do things. But what I've tried to do is to break every complex process or action down into sub-chunks, test them and reassemble them, and see if I can make them work. And along the way, I've learned some things that are very helpful.
Paul, you've said to me before that you've learned a lot by kind of not being a natural. And I would also say being sort of isolated in Columbus, Ohio, away from a lot of the a lot of the other kind of major Aikido influences. So you had a kind of laboratory to develop your own thing, and you treat your own experience as a laboratory as well, right?
Yes, exactly. And what I started with was the concept of intention. And I don't use the word ki or energy. It means too many different things to too many different people. But I was a new teacher, and I noticed that people lost balance in the direction of the attack. They were focusing their attention on the attack. So I tried to get them to stop. And then I realized that it wasn't just, I started by thinking they were leaning in the direction. And I finally realized they were thinking in that direction. So I spent a number of years, half hour a day, walking and thinking from different spots of my body out into the environment in different directions. And then eventually it coalesced into a field of awareness, and sort of like a star shining in all directions. And that was the basic thing that I've learned to work with. And that's very unlike any Aikido that I know of.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that field of awareness? That's very interesting.
No, but I can tell you how to do it. One of the things that I'm very interested in is what kind of a definition will transfer information. If I talk words about it, it's like giving a person a fish net to eat instead of a fish. Okay, let's try something, if you will. Pay attention to the floor. Where do you keep the floor? Where is it?
Yeah,
down there.
I'm doing that for you.
Right. Can you also think of the sky? So you're thinking in two directions at once, establishing a pole of awareness through your body.
Ah, I see where you're going. Yes, I can do that.
And can you do the other four horizontal directions?
Yeah, that's actually a technique I teach people.
Okay, great. You're the first person I've run into that.
Oh no, it's actually part of traditional Buddhism.
Okay, that's good.
It's called the Six Directions. It's a huge theme in Tibetan practice.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Six directions breathing. I take the breath as a carrier wave and extend it in the six directions. And then after a number of years of that, I was able to fill in. I could hold 12 or 13 directions originating in my body in the same thought.
Yeah, that That's terrific. Yes, I understand. It's related actually to, now you're getting into my field, which is comparative meditation techniques.
Right.
So I could just go on and on about what you just reported.
Please do.
In my approach, which is, I call it unified mindfulness because I try to give people a unified perspective on things. So what you're describing comes under, like you, I have categories, subcategories, subcategories. So it comes under the theme of what I would call spatial resolution, the ability to be precise about location of experience.
Mm-hmm.
There's also qualitative resolution, the ability to be precise about a type of experience. There's also what we might call interaction awareness, the ability to know this experience will tend to trigger this. And then there's the ability to monitor intensity levels. So basically, you've got 6 interrogatives for monitoring your sensory experience. How much of what, when, and where, interacting in what ways, and changing in what ways.
Yeah.
So what you just described is one of the systematic exercises that we would give people to develop the spatial component of being able to detect the where of things. However, what happens is that can be, of course, applied to any experience, any category of experience. And as you do that, you go from a theme of spatial, meaning I can localize it in space, to spacious,
yes,
which means it is actually made of space.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and this is, if you go to the Tibetan Dzogchen and Mahamudra literature, you'll see a lot of reference to spaciousness. If you go to early Buddhist literature in Theravada, there's talk about what's called formless absorptions, and one of them is boundless space.
Yes.
Certain formulations of Zen rework yang and yin into expansion and contraction. And the exercise that you just described helps people actually get in contact with both of those. And by the way, this is expansion and contraction, not used metaphorically, where expansion is good and contraction is bad.
Yes.
That's a different thing. So what you just described is as actually a long tradition and many interesting relationships to a whole lot of stuff.
Right. Let me say something about where I've gone with this. One of the things that I realized is actions are vectors. They have a direction through space and an intensity.
So you see a big smile on my face,
yes.
Right? I can't, you gotta love a guy that uses the word vector in a normal conversation.
Well, this is not a normal conversation.
I thought you might get on this. I used the word vector in Shinzen. I used the word vector, having heard it from Paul in one of your discussion groups, and the gentleman leading the group was like, that's a good way of putting it. And I thought, yep, that's a Shinzen word, vector. So,
and what I found is the self I define as a volume, and the actions of the self are lines through space. Does that make sense? And what
yeah, this is amazingly, it's close, not identical, okay, but in some ways remarkably close to one of my ways that I like to talk about things.
Let me try something. I'll see if I can focus this camera elsewhere. Now, the people listening to it won't be able to see this, but let's see. Can you see me? Yes.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. the tremor on the Parkinsons, as soon as I start doing Aikido or movement practice, the tremor disappears. And this, I've had Parkinson's for 15 years. What I'm doing is not possible. I had a crown put on a couple of weeks ago at the dentist, of course, and I was able to suppress the tremors for an hour and a half. I don't suppress the tremors. I start quietness. It's not that I'm fighting the tremors or anything, but I start the quietness, and that stills the tremors. I haven't yet got to the point where I can keep the focus and talk, but I can do Aikido and be peaceful.
Listeners won't actually realize that Paul just stood up and did a bunch of Aikido and karate type movements. But what was interesting, if you listen back to this, so if you're listening back to this, you won't notice like normally when people are moving, there's a sort of pause in breath and a jitteriness, and actually his voice almost didn't change all the way through that. So I can imagine listeners being a little bit surprised to hear that you were standing up and moving around or doing that.
And if they had been privileged to the video that Mark and I see, they would know that all the Parkinsonism was gone. The movements were smooth and continuous.
Yes.
And I started to get a little high on your flow of ki. It's pretty evident. I sometimes, that gives me an idea. I've been looking for videos of people moving from the no self. I'll bet you could send me some videos that are on YouTube that I could reference for my students, send it as a reference to students.
I would imagine that what you're talking about, I'd call enhanced self, not no self. Because what I'm trying to do, if I can demonstrate very easily, it's not theology or philosophy, that when you're feeling kindness towards an opponent, your body, there, see? Even when I start thinking about that, my body quiets down. I can hit harder and throw harder when I'm quiet and kind. And so I see compassion, love, and power are the same thing, just spelled differently.
Now, you do know, you are aware in the contemplative traditions of the world that about half of the, shall we say, enlightened people historically have tended to formulate it the way I just did, and the other half have tended to formulate it in the way that you just did. In other words, realizing a quote no self is identical, as far as I've ever been able to tell experientially, from realizing a quote big self.
Actually, I don't know that, because I long ago gave up reading stuff because I couldn't understand it. So I had to go back to my body to test things out. And as long as we're thinking about that, today is April Fool's Day, right? One day when I was meditating, a little thing came to me, and I'll recite it for your benefit. I hope it won't do too much damage. Round and round my mind is going, working on my Zenish koan. Has the Buddha nature a cow is what I'm wondering now. Moo.
That's great.
One of our jokes.
Well, actually, the fact that this is April Fool's Day has not been lost on me. And I have been known to be eccentric, so who knows what's going to happen. But so far, I've been pretty contained.
Maybe that's actually a place to look at. Like, what is the role of humor? Like, one thing I'm always dubious when I meet a school of meditation or Aikido that's lost its sense of humor. And one of my biggest worries about politics currently is the lack of humor sometimes I'm seeing. And, that's one feature I've always liked about both of you. Like, what is the role of humor? Is it something more than just mild entertainment?
Yes. I deliberately use humor to break the seriousness frame. A lot of my work is with people who've been abused or traumatized in some way. And if you can make jokes without losing the seriousness, you breathe again. I had somebody that I was working with recall under my hands as I helped him into his body, re-experience being raped as a part of a gang ritual when he was a kid. So he came out and he was really shaken. And I said, quick, how many ritual abuse perpetrators does it take to screw a light bulb?
Oh, that's great.
What? And I said, 13,
oh my God, that's so brilliant.
13, 1 to screw it and 12 to chant. And he broke out laughing, and he thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. And he was back in the room. He had his breath again. So I use humor to break the seriousness.
What was it again? The exact quote?
How many ritual abuse perpetrators does it take to screw a light bulb? 13, 1 to screw it and 12 to chant. That's probably the most tasteless joke I've ever told, but it worked at the time.
Did you make it up?
Yes, of course, right on the spur of the moment.
So the spontaneity there's key. The spontaneity was in Paul's movement before, and is a feature of Zen as well, as I understand it. Maybe Shinzen can confirm, and also of humor. Like there's something about that spontaneous arising that's really powerful.
So let me just respond. So how many Zen monks does it take to screw in a light bulb?
None.
I'm going to, well, that's a possibility, but the joke at hand is 4. 1 to screw it, 1 to unscrew it, 1 to deny its existence, and 1 to incorporate all of the above into a nonprofit religious organization.
Yes, that sounds very good. How many martial art? No, we shouldn't go in that direction.
Yes, we should. We should. One more.
One more. How many abuse survivors does it take to change a light bulb? None. We just huddle in the dark.
Wow.
Okay. I think
you got the moxie, man. But obviously, it's working.
Yes.
So
it's called victim's humor. Victim's humor takes the power back from the oppressor.
Is this an actual known thing, victim's humor?
I don't know. I think it is.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone who teaches it as a...
Well, yeah, but if you're a victim, it just happens.
That's really, really interesting. That's very edgy to be able to pull something like that off. I can give you a cultural analog of that.
Sure.
Shamanic ordeal humor.
Yes, well.
So this is another gallows humor situation.
Mm-hmm.
Our remote ancestors, as far as I can tell, studying anthropology, our remote ancestors all over the planet were drawn. Well, they had a life that was simple, uncomfortable, and full of things you could never understand. And they were drawn sometimes to further simplify, further get uncomfortable, and further surrender to don't know in the form of shamanic ordeals, sacrifice, physical. Native people in the U.S. would call it a sacrifice that you have to make because you're asking God for something.
Right.
You only own your whole body. So there's a sort of escalating sequence of intensity in Native American spirituality that is reflected elsewhere around the world, but in the North American Native context, it will often start with your you sit in a sweat lodge and it's hot, maybe a little hot, maybe like really, really, really hot. And you sort of have to have equanimity with that, openness to that. And then maybe after you've done a number of years of that, they say, well, why don't you go vision quest? And now you have to spend 4 days without food, water, shelter, or sleep, exposed in nature. And then after that's completed, if you get a vision, you might escalate to sort of seminary, if I were to make a metaphor. And that's something called the Sundance.
Yes,
which
I've heard of that.
You've heard of it. What's interesting to me is I will sometimes describe the physicality of that ceremony to medical professionals, asking them, given what I've described, how long will a human being live? And they usually say, oh, no more than 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they do it for 4 days, men, women, and children every year, hundreds and hundreds. And I know because I've seen it with my own eyes. So what I can tell you about that ceremony is that there is an enormous amount of humor in that ceremony, because it is so deadly serious. It's as serious as death. By the third day, you are absolutely hovering between life and death. And the assistants, it's their job to make sure you don't die, but they won't give you food or water. I mean, unless you're going to die.
Right.
They won't let you die, but they'll let you be very, very close to die. And everyone makes jokes constantly. And the most difficult time is the afternoon of the third day, because at least on the fourth day, you know that evening you're going to get food and water. You're going to get the piercings are going to be
removed
out of you, and so forth. So, but the third day, the afternoon, is very, very difficult physically. Just imagine 200 human beings barely holding on to life, dancing together. And that's called the Heyoka round. Heyokas are thunder clowns. They are contraries. They're they're born on April Fool's Day, metaphorically. And they mock the ceremony. And they make jokes, and they talk to the dancers, and they crack you up, and they pretend like they're drinking water. And so anyway, this victim's humor has an analog in shaman's humor. I can report that ethnographically.
Well, there's one joke that I think sums it up. Mark has heard me tell this. It's a terrible joke, but what the hell, so to speak. What did Satan say to Hitler when Hitler got to hell? Oi, if I'd known you were coming, I would have baked the cake.
So for listeners, a kike is a racial term for Jewish people, and both of these guys are Jewish.
So we can tell this, but other people cannot.
That is hilarious. Wait a minute.
You see what it does? It frees you.
Yeah. Okay.
I just was in Israel a few days ago, actually, and there was rocket attacks, and again, quite a lot of this kind of humor was happening. Well,
of course,
we were getting our training disrupted by Hamas.
Well, I'll give you another one that has been close to the bone, so to speak. Life is a good news, bad news joke. The good news is that through pain and suffering, we gain wisdom. The bad news is that there's more good news coming.
It's very true. These are great jokes, dude. I'm copying all this. You know,
no, I'm going to get it twice a year now. It's,
yes. We can do it at the same time in each of his ears.
Yeah, that's really I love that. Yeah, and actually, if they don't know the word kike,
it doesn't work.
It's well, there's that, but see, there are many terms for Jewish people. There's a whole range of slurs, many of which we ourselves use. But actually, different. Kike is one we don't use that often. Okay, so that's at the top of the
top of the.
That's the K. That's the K bomb.
Cake. That's the icing on the cake.
K bomb.
Yeah.
We need a really good insult for white people. We haven't got a really good one yet. They just don't.
Well, we do. It's cracker.
It's not, but it's still like it's a 5 out of 10 max. You know, it hasn't got quite the same.
Well, you could just say whitey.
Whitey again. You know, I mean, Irish. We've got a few going as well, but they're not quite the same level. So the freeing power of humor.
Well, I'm interested. My humor is not intentional. It just sort of happens. I don't even know why. It's just a part of things. But it sounds to me like you've actually done it a little more systematically.
Yes, I use
because of the nature of the work you do.
Yeah, my basic algorithm is identify the presenting problem, find the much smaller, much easier, much less hurtful equivalent, and then work on empowerment with that smaller version, and gradually through calibrated gradations of attacks or challenges, get people to the point where they can comfortably speak about what happened and do something that in the present day would protect them. Then they're finished. And one thing that I think I haven't talked about that's very important in my work, definitions. People don't define their terms. I was watching an online discussion whether Aikido is a martial art or not, and people were screaming on both sides of it, but they hadn't noticed that they were defining martial art in a totally different manner. So one of the things I do is tell people emotions are actions you do in the body. Feelings are what those actions feel like when you do them. And you cannot stop an action. You can only start an incompatible one. So I have to teach people how to define what they're doing and how to use rigorous language in a definition and in a hypothesis testing, which is very against the grain for most people. They believe what they believe. They don't want to pin it down and then test it, because it could be that they're believing something that isn't so. They'd rather not know that, I guess. But the act of defining something as a concrete, quantifiable element of your work, that makes things very much quicker and deeper.
Anyone that's listening that is familiar with me is probably chuckling right now, because everything you just said is directly what I emphasize. My phrase is, say what you mean. And I try to train both my students and my facilitators in that. That we do talk about a lot. So I can see why Mark thought you and I had a lot in common.
Yeah, so can I now.
The ways that we talk about things, logic, evidence, divide and conquer, give people small manageable tasks, start at the weakest link. These are all standard things. And say what you mean. It's from Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. What most people don't know is that Lewis Carroll is just
a logician and a mathematician.
Yes, you know that fact.
Yes.
See?
And there are a lot of those kinds of jokes in Alice in Wonderland.
There's mathematical jokes, and there's an entire book. You may have read the book, I think, just on the mathematical puns in Alice in Wonderland. Someone actually wrote a book about that, the math that underlies it.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, the say what you mean. Like even the Tea Party is an allusion to the use of the variable t in his day for imaginary numbers, which he was against. Not I. That's right. What we would now call I think some people related it to t, or it does relate to time, because time is imaginary in relativity. So I'm not quite sure of the details, but the tea in the Tea Party itself is a math pun. But in any event, the marsh hare and the dormouse and the Mad Hatter and Alice are having this discussion, and the Mad Hatter says something to the effect that you should always say what you mean. And Alice says, well, I do that. I always mean what I say. And then they all chime in and say, no, saying what you mean is completely unrelated to meaning what you say. So there's logic, right? Yeah. And so that definition thing that you emphasize, oh my God, I've just seen it over the years, over and over and over again. Individuals talking at cross purposes. Not talking. Yeah, they're just talking across each other
Uh-huh.
because they're using words and they don't have a sophistication on the definition. So the goal of practice is samadhi. No, the goal of practice is not samadhi. No, the goal of practice is samadhi. The
Well,
goal of
depends what you
practice
mean.
is to find the true self. No, the goal of practice is to find there truly is no self. No, the goal of practice is to find the true self. Now, but without sitting down, and what do you mean by samadhi? What do you
Right.
mean by self, no self, true self, and so forth? So, yep, that's I can see. It looks to me like you've discovered most of this on your own.
Yes, I have.
You're autodidact,
I
and
guess.
I'm. That's a fancy word for someone who taught themselves.
Self-taught. Well, I had to teach myself because nobody else spoke language that I could understand. They were talking about keep one point, extend key, all kinds of stuff, and I couldn't. They didn't give me a blueprint for doing it. And the fallacy they were running under is if you name a process, that thereby explains it and says how to do it, and it doesn't. It's just a name. There's a painting by Magritte, I think. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. It's a picture of a drawing of a pipe floating in midair, and the caption says, "This is not a pipe. It's a drawing of a pipe." And what I often use to get that across: if you went to a restaurant, would you eat the menu or the food?
Oh my God, dude! I use that.
Well, maybe we're really the same person, connected up in a higher dimension.
Actually, I think we're just riding on the Jewish comedian Platonic archetype here.
Yes, I think you're right.
There's definitely a cultural piece of work here, and I do wonder why so many of my teachers are Jewish, and there's something in the humour that I resonate with.
Well, maybe it has to do with that whole thing about victims and shamanic ordeals. You know, I don't know, but you know, it used to really suck to be Jewish in certain times in certain places.
Yeah, I know.
So maybe. How old are you, Paul?
73.
Yeah, believe it or not, I got a couple of years on you.
Really?
But close, yeah.
When you have a couple of years, are you younger or older? That means
older.
Okay, well, you can come throw me around.
Much.
Not much. You can come throw me around, and I'll meditate at you if you throw me around.
But so I was born in 1944, the year that the camps were liberated into a Jewish environment. Probably you had, you know,
similar. Born in 45.
Yeah. And that they were still liberating the camps. And man, when we were little babies, that's what was wafting around in our families. Those revelations. Jesus, that must have done something.
Yeah, well, I had a client not a few years ago who was born in the displaced persons camp after the war to two survivors of the Holocaust. And he came because he had severe back problems. And the way I work is if I can solve it by doing a movement change, then it's not a big deal. You just do the movement change and go home. You're cool. But if it keeps coming back, there's a job in the inner ecosystem for that behavior or sensation. And I took him into his body, and what he realized was when his parents touched him, they touched him with such terror that they had brought a child into this world, and they didn't know whether there was going to be a Holocaust. So that terror in his body, he crunched his whole back in the fight, freeze, flight thing, and ground his back down. And it was because the terror was transmitted by touch from his parents.
You know what's interesting is you had to teach yourself because you couldn't understand what they were saying. Mm-hmm. And that caused you to understand things in a deeper way, at least in certain areas. Mm-hmm, yeah. That's the narrative that I'm getting. Yeah. And it's an interesting parallel with me because my autodidact is not so much in the meditation. I have followed traditions, but I get a little bit of what you're talking about actually in the science domain. I couldn't understand science. You can look at my high school transcript. I flunked algebra 3 times. I flunked geometry twice. I flunked anything quantified. And I had to just I had to learn it on my own terms.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But it has allowed me to look at science I notice now that I am actually a functioning scientist. I have my own lab. I have staff I work with. I have a university I'm affiliated with. I'm actually a scientist. The guy with no degree,
Mm-hmm.
the guy with no training.
Plenty of training.
With no formal training. Yeah. So the fact that I was so bad at this stuff, and then I had to teach myself, I notice when I interact with other scientists, I've got a little different direction with things.
Yes.
And I can see a resonance of that with you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, apropos of the Holocaust, did you see the movie Schindler's List?
Yes.
What was that like for you?
That was a long time ago. I think, I don't know how to say this. I could resonate with it.
Tell the train story, Paul, as well.
The train story? Which train story?
When you were visiting Germany.
Oh, that. Yes. I've taught in Germany since 2001, once or twice a year, and I speak pretty fluent German at this point. But one of the early times that I was in Germany, I was there for an Aikido conference that a friend of mine from Chicago, Don Levine, was also going to. We were on the same train. No, he was on the train, and it was an express. He watched out the windows as the German crowds watched this train go by, and he had a panic reaction, which he hadn't expected, because it resonated with him for all the cattle cars full of people being taken to the concentration camps, and the people on the platform watching the train. My equivalent on that same trip, after the Aikidos, it was at a university. After the Aikido, we all went into the showers, and I stepped into the group showers and froze, which I certainly had not expected, but I had to take some time to unfreeze.
I just took a flight from Berlin to Tel Aviv about a week ago, and coming out of this flight, they only had one car to take us from the airplane to the terminal, and so they had to basically, the German staff were cramming all the Israelis into this wagon to get us to the airport, and everyone was in this like crazy like fight-flight mode, and I kind of clicked like, oh, there's a real resonance here that's way bigger than the current moment.
Yes.
I had an interesting experience. So when I was with this whole thing, it's why I asked about the Schindler's List, since we were on that topic.
Yeah.
So when I was young, I couldn't handle emotions at all.
Of course.
At all. And we're not just talking about emotions in me, emotions in anyone, especially in adults.
Yes.
If an adult had a bereavement or an issue and they were decompensating, and I'm in the room,
for you.
I would just freak out. And so, there was a lot of denial early on. I couldn't go near the topic of the Holocaust. I couldn't go near that topic. It was just too much. And, you would have relatives or people in synagogue, you would see them with tattooed numbers, and it's like, oh my God, it's that close. And so I just couldn't touch it. So, okay, I get into meditation, do the things I do. So a number of years ago, this friend of mine in San Francisco says, oh, we need to go see this movie. Everyone's talking about this movie, and it's the it's the latest thing, and let's go see this movie together. So I didn't even ask what the movie is. It's like, this person wants to see this movie. It's a Spielberg. Can't be bad. So I have no idea at all. The movie's just being released. We go into a theater, so it's not on television. It's the a very big screen in San Francisco, one of the big famous theaters there in the town. We're on the really big screen, and we have really good seats. And this movie starts up, and it takes me about 5 minutes to realize, oh shit.
Yes.
Here I am, and it's as big and bright and loud as it's gonna get, right? And so I remember thinking, okay, I got to make a decision here as to what I'm going to do. Am I going to just walk out and say, I really don't want to deal with this? Sorry, I didn't know it was on this. Or am I going to use my practice? So I decided, okay, I'm going to do a technique. I'm just going to implement a formal technique throughout the entire movie. And for some reason, instead of taking the technique of observing my reactions, which would be a possible choice, I chose the technique of focusing on external sight and sound of the movie, which would cause a merging experience if done in high concentration. So I decided to escape into that and actually live it. And all the characters sort of become them, unbecome myself for, an hour and a half. And wow, it was amazing. When it was over and we walked out of the theater, I just felt great. I felt clean.
In what way did that happen?
Well, because there was a breaking up of that material, that holding from the early life, because of the focus strategy that I'd applied.
Yes. Well, I think that there might be a similarity between my work and the blues, the music form. What I do is, one of the things that I do most often is what I call frying the words. So if you pick a word which has resonance to the difficulty or challenge, and you open your body, stabilize your posture, radiate, ground, all that good stuff, and then say the word, it has no effect on you anymore. So you're breaking the stimulus response connection. You take the old stimulus, put a new response in, and then it reminds you to be strong and present, not remind you that once upon a time you were weak and helpless.
And you call that frying the word?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm writing that down. Yes. By the way, in my language, if I were to translate into my language, you are teaching certain attentional skills.
Yes.
And one of them is what we would technically call equanimity. That's what you're calling the openness.
Yes.
And once again, it's a matter of definition, but I can tell you that what you're calling the openness is very close to what I would refer to as equanimity. But then you're also teaching something else. You're teaching sensory clarity.
Yes.
You're teaching people the how much of what, when, and where, interacting in what ways, changing in what ways, some subset of that. And I would also say, from my perspective, that you're teaching another quality, which is concentration power.
Yes.
And that's my definition of mindful awareness. Concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity working together.
I can see that. And the way I practice it is, when somebody comes in with a strike or a punch, before I do a movement, I'm settling. And then I stay settled as long as I can while I'm doing the movement to protect myself. So if you don't have an enemy who's kind enough to keep attacking you down through the years, you'll never get over the fear and anger. You have to have friendly enemies who will keep drawing it into you, and then you get a chance to tame it.
Wow, this is really interesting. Friendly enemies is exactly what the other monks and nuns are in your monastery. That's what monastic training is. You're surrounded by friendly enemies that push your buttons, but not too much, and not out of meanness, but out of wanting to. Yeah. They want to empower you.
Yeah.
So you're describing the sociology of a monastery when it works well.
Yes.
I imagine. If I may, there's a difference in the Paul's work is kind of calibrated, systematic trigger practice physically and then verbally, which is the big move away from normal Aikido. So he'll use verbal triggers as well. Whereas in, say, a monastery or a meditation retreat, it's like less systematically calibrated. Paul also has a bunch of techniques that could be called nurture positive in your system, Shinzen. Like think of someone who makes your heart smile. That's a classic Paul kind of nurture positive technique as well. So make another link.
Yeah. I think people generally, if I ask where would you go to practice being in a cooperative, constructive group, people usually say, and we'll find something in which we can undertake a cooperative, constructive project. And I say, no, that doesn't work. You can already get along with your friends. You've got to find a situation of opposition and antagonism in which to learn to be cooperative and constructive. Because if you don't, you're able to do it only when it isn't difficult.
Exactly. Yeah, that's there's some math behind that, by the way. It's called the strength of weak connections.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually the term, and it's in graph theory, which is a mathematical formalism for modeling connectivity, among other things. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the connectivity of a society, how polarized or not polarized it is, Mark was alluding to this very noticeable polarization that's occurring in certain parts of the world, or maybe the whole world. Yeah. So one of the things that predicts that militates against, that works against a society becoming polarized against itself, is if people make casual connections with people that are very, very different from them.
Right.
In other words, do you have a society where, let's say, you've got red and blue, I guess is the US thing now. So you got the reds and the blues. So how many occasional interactions do reds have with blues, where it's human interactions, and the other way around? If there are many of those, even though they're just occasional, and even though they may be around disagreement, if they are human interactions, not arguments, but actual human relationships. So those are weak relationships, because mostly if you're red, you stay around red. If you're blue, you stay around blue. But can you be around the other color and be a human being? Those are weak connections, but how strong are they? How frequent are they?
You have enough of them to be strong.
Yeah. If there are a lot of weak connections, even though the groups may disagree, they don't polarize mathematically. But if those weak connections are not there, they will tend to polarize. What you're describing is the exercise that anyone that's living in a polarized environment, be it Israel, the US, UK with Brexit, what have you, what you're describing is the exercise that all parties should be taking on logically, scientifically, if we want to be more like a happy family and less like a civil war.
An exercise that I've developed for groups. At the beginning, I have everybody stand in a circle and hold hands and feel that even though they're in a group, the responsibility for their thoughts and the behaviors is all together with them. They have to be responsible to themselves and not give up their autonomy to the group. Then I have them drop hands and feel that even though they're not in contact, they still relate to the group and must be ethical in the group sense. You see what I'm doing? I'm trying to not, if they hold hands and feel part of the group, that can overwhelm, and then somebody will say, I was just following orders. If they hold hands and feel separate, and then drop hands and feel connected, then we've got something where we're balancing different qualities, and I hope it'll work better in life.
Yeah, I can see why Mark wanted us to get together, because the kindred spirit here is, what's the term? Lone maverick genius?
Yeah, something like that.
There's a few others I could throw in there. And I'm glad you guys have come back around to ethics, because first of all, I think this is one of Paul's major contributions. Like, I've studied ethics at the university level, and at no point did anyone talk about embodiment. And Shinzen, I heard you speak very beautifully and skillfully about some of the ways senior teachers, people in traditions can be more ethical. And this is a really hot topic right now with the guru model, which I think you two have always instinctively rejected, perhaps culturally as well, is now sort of falling down in yoga. I think martial arts is a little bit behind. Increasingly people are seeing a problem with this guru model,
right,
and realizing the disempowerment of that. While simultaneously there's a sort of another move to a kind of new kind of nastiness and a new kind of illogic. So I'm seeing a really positive trend at the moment, and one that really worries me and is personal.
What's the worrisome trend? Can you describe that?
Yeah,
concentration camps.
No, the rejection of logic and reason as a sort of patriarchal Western imperialist tool. And
really? Give me a break.
No, really. This is really a thing. And the privileging of the subjective.
Wait. Logic and evidence are now part of privilege in some camps.
This is how some people see it, and also feelings over fact.
I gotta write this down. There's a phrase in English: you don't know whether to laugh or cry.
That's how I'm feeling a lot at the moment.
Well, I think there really is a rejection of logic, because once you learn to think, once an authority has approved of your not being logical, of your taking something on faith, once you have learned that you can take something on faith, there's no boundary, there's nothing you can't take if the authority says it's true. And that's very dangerous for the authority, because once their every whim becomes ethical, they can do anything they want to, and it's ethical.
I think this is the first piece, and Shinzen, you'd given some conditions as well, where you ways to prevent abuse, ways that I think you talked about feedback loops, for example.
Right.
Maybe you could repeat some of those, because this was a really hot topic on the retreat that people were really interested in, and you gave a very solid answer to. Do you remember the question?
Yeah, but you said that Paul had made some interesting contributions or creativity in this area of what we might call character, ethics, behavior, morality. We call it Shila, technically SHILA or SILA are the Buddhist terms for this. I'd be interested in, Mark, what you had in mind when you said that Paul had some innovations in this direction.
Okay. I think he had nothing in mind. He had it in his body, I hope.
That's the point, yeah.
Yeah. I can show you a couple of them. It's not quite as good as if I had somebody here to demonstrate with. But if you... No, that's not it. If you take a braced... Can you see me? Yes. A braced, stable stance, and have somebody push on your shoulders. If you say something kind to them, you're a very nice person, I'm glad I know you, you will tend to stay in your stable braced position. If you say you're an asshole, you're easily pushed back right away. If you raise your eyebrows, you're easily pushed back right away. It's the fear startled response, but it's mechanical. It's not cognitive. If you raise your eyebrows, the body says, gee, I must be afraid. Let's get out of here. If you tell a lie, it's hard to maintain postural stability. There's a whole bunch of things. If you mumble, I have people count out loud, 1, 2, 3, and they're stable. And if I say, no, count out loud, 1, 2, 3, as soon as they slacken their mouth, everything slackens.
If listeners want to see demos, just go to YouTube and put in Paul Linden. There's one video called Kind Power, another called Body, Mind and Spirit, where you can see the demos of this. And it's basically showing people that ethical responses are in the body, and that kindness and strength are two sides of the same coin. Actually, not just talking about it philosophically, but really demonstrating it in very sort of quick, fun ways. And that idea of ethics being embodied as a form of strength, is not something I've come across while reading literature on this, which is about rules or, Kantian imperatives or this kind of thing. So this was an addition to my own understanding of ethics when I came across this.
One of the things that I use to define my sense of ethics is love without power is ineffective. Power without love is brutality. And if you don't have power and love as a compassionate, effective way of meeting the world, you'll go down in flames at some point.
The key embodied piece, I think, to ethics as well is realizing that numbing creates a circle of violence where, hurt people, or hurt people get numb and therefore find it easier to hurt people. So that insight is a key embodied peace building insight, right, Paul? Am I paraphrasing?
Yes, absolutely. And it goes round and round. The effect of anesthesia is the willingness to hurt people. And when you hurt people, you need more anesthesia because the body, so to speak, does not like hurting people. If you imagine living inside the skin of somebody who relates to people by raping them. Everybody has the right to live in hell, of course, but I wouldn't want to live inside that person's skin.
What Shinzen was adding to this as well was talking about systems. So you're looking at it at a very individual level of the kind of body mind. And what I've been really appreciating lately is people talking about like structures and systems and ethics. Like we have a co-teachers on the EFC course, for example, and I have to vote. We have a vote to throw someone off the course. And there's certain systems of feedback and structure that exist. I think this is one of the things you mentioned, Shinzen, in terms of where you've seen this go right and wrong.
Well, yeah, I've been in the meditation business my whole life, one way or another. First as a kid, fascinated with Asian culture, then as an academic, trained to be a Buddhist scholar, actually, was what I was going to be. But then I got shunted into practice, away from scholarship. And then I got further sort of enlarged with the whole science thing. But one way or another, I've spent my entire life either in traditional meditation practices or in trying to change those practices reflected in the light of science. So I've seen a lot, and I have seen numerous situations where the guru thing became really problematic, like you described. It's been very close to me. It happened with not one and not two, but quite a few of people that taught me eventually became fallen gurus. And so I've seen it close up. And there's also the history of my own flaws and the fact that other teachers had to do interventions on me because I got off one way or another, got off track. So based on those decades and decades and decades, I have formulated a way of thinking about these issues that I believe addresses the issue. In other words, and I'm not going to go into details because it just, it's a long conversation. And I think we're at a good point now. We might be considering winding up at some point here. But just let me quickly say that, first of all, so Paul was talking a lot about saying what you mean, being clear about the use of language. So I would say that mindfulness is the cultivation and application of 3 attentional skills: concentration, clarity, and equanimity. So then we can spend a long time defining those skills. We can describe them, we can give subdivisions within them, and so forth. We can also say, okay, here's the elements you need in order to develop those skills. One of the interesting things, though, is, okay, why would you want to develop those skills? Well, you'd want to develop those skills broadly for your human flourishing. Or we could call it happiness. We could go Greek and say eudaimonia. We could go Latinate and say felicity. I just like to say happiness, but then I'll say happiness in the broadest and deepest sense possible. That gives us a periodic table of happiness elements. And I'm going to claim that these attentional skills are central, but not all. They're central factors, but they're not all the factors that cause or optimize human happiness. So first of all, we're going to define positive behavior change or good character as one of the things that makes human beings happy. If you have good character, that's a potential aspect of happiness.
Yes.
Therefore, because we're going to claim that these attentional skills are related to elevating happiness, one of the things that we can use these attentional skills for is to improve our behavior. And there's 2 ways we can do that. And Paul, you've described both of them. One is you can use that concentration, clarity, and equanimity to deconstruct negative forces within you.
Right.
The other is that you can use those skills to construct positive behavior forces within you. So all of that involves mindfulness, but I'm saying that although these skills may be central, they're not all that's involved. So when we look at situations where gurus or in general authority figures have the wheels have come off, individually and or organizationally. What you will find is that they were lacking factors. They may have used their mindfulness skills to deconstruct negative. They may have used their mindfulness skills to strengthen positive. But there were factors that are not skills, that are not meditation, that lie outside of meditation, factors that weren't in place. And the 2 most important factors are what I call keeping the feedback channels open so that people can confront you. The organization should be designed to allow for that, and the individual teacher should encourage it. So I call that keeping the feedback channels open. Everyone knows they can confront you. So you can get a consensus of feedback on how you're carrying yourself in the world. That's number 1. Number 2, you may need what I would refer to as a behaviorally oriented accountability and support structure.
Yes.
That is different from meditation.
Right.
So if you look at individual teachers and individual organizations, if they use their practice to strengthen positive behavior, weaken negative behavior, and if that's not enough, they have the feedback channels to make sure that there's a constant evolutionary pressure for them, for the teacher to respond to what they're doing. And if a teacher is willing to understand that they may need a 12-step program, they may need a psychotherapist, they may need a counselor who is spiritually much less experienced, but psychologically more mature, that you may need that accountability and support structure. I've been in therapy. I've seen a psychiatrist for behavioral issues that I couldn't crack with my practice. So I'm going to claim that when you look at the situations where problems develop, all four of the factors I just mentioned are not going to be present. The converse, or the contrapositive, I guess, if those factors, no, it's a converse. If those factors are present, then the problems won't develop. That has also been my experience. So I think it's pretty straightforward. You mentioned, like, okay, there's a Kantian imperative, or there's the 10 Commandments, etc. People have different philosophical and or religious cultural basis for ethics. For me, the basis of ethics is keeping the feedback channels open. It's not so much the list of rules, although that may have a place.
Okay, well, I'm thinking we'll move towards close relatively soon. Paul, how is your energy levels doing? You doing okay for a bit?
That's why I'm standing up, so I can keep myself focused.
I thought so, yeah.
It's about the end of my medication cycle, so I'll be okay.
And I feel we've had a nice interaction. It's about 90 minutes. I'm definitely good.
Okay, well, let me point listeners to being-in-movement.com. So if they Google Paul Linden Aikido, they'll come up with that and a bunch of YouTube clips. Paul and Shinzen have both had other episodes on the podcast as well, if you want more from the podcast. And Shinzen can be found at shinzen.org, is it, on unifiedmindfulness.com?
There's lots of them, but the two you just mentioned, shinzen.org and unifiedmindfulness.com, are good places to go. From there, you'll find a lot of free resources, YouTube materials, free lessons, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a good kind of introduction to the Unified Mindfulness system that's free online, stuff that sounds true, but just stuff on YouTube. I mean, some really good resources out there. So this has been a bit special, actually.
For me as well.
I've enjoyed seeing you guys connect and the points of similarity and the play there. Really enjoyed it a lot. Very satisfying. Yeah. And closing comments from either of you about the body, the world today, or anything you like.
Yeah, when do we get together and play, Shinzen?
I don't know. Columbus isn't on my circuit.
Yeah, a lot of people would say that.
But my closing remark, people often ask me, because in my particular political subculture, people are pretty upset about things, how things are going. And Shinzen, do you have any suggestions? And I do have a suggestion. I would just say that there's two parts to the suggestion, and they're both technical terms. Have very specific meaning, technical phrases that if you're interested, you could look up. But if I had to end with a soundbite for what to do about the world, I would say two things: love deeply and act effectively.
Yes.
Paul, closing comments.
Well, let me think. I don't know why, but the thought comes to me, no matter how long it's been since you learned to ride a bike, you'll never forget the skill of falling off. And so I try to watch for that in myself and do better, a little bit better every day. That's all. That's as much as I can think about.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Both much appreciated.
And Mark, I want to express my deepest appreciation for you and for how you've helped bring this into the world, and to Shinzen for laughing at some of my jokes.
Cheers, guys. Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.